I too lament the change in mass media because now we don't even get a true reporting of the news. It's that, the news reports they're reporting on what's the divisive communication that's happening on Twitter. And news is going to Twitter, to find your news instead of giving us the real news.
Marcus Aurelius said, "What we do in life echoes through eternity." What is your life echoing through eternity? Welcome to Echoes Through Eternity with Dr. Jeffrey Skinner. Our mission is to inspire, engage, and encourage leaders from across the globe to plant missional churches and be servant leaders. So join us and hear the stories of servant leaders reverberating lives as God echoes them through eternity. Brought to you by Missional Church Planting and Leadership Development and Dynamic Church Planting International.
Welcome into Echoes Through Eternity. I am your host, Dr. Jeffrey D. Skinner. I'm joined in the studio today by Dr. Rondi Smith. Rondi was recently interviewed on a mutual friend of ours podcast, Michael Johnson, Dr. Michael Johnson. His episode is actually playing right now in season 2. He was the launch of my season 2 podcast there. Great interview with Michael. He did an awesome interview with Dr. Smith here. And I knew when I heard that interview that I had to have Dr. Smith here in the studio with me today, talking about her ministry at Rest Stop Ministries and just her calling, God's calling on her life. She is certainly a voice that God is echoing through eternity. Welcome, Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Dr. Skinner. And I'm so glad that our mutual friend, Dr. Johnson, reconnected us. And that's one of the things I love about what Michael in the middle is doing, is just reconnecting a lot of folks that get an opportunity now to catch up. So
yeah. We talked a lot in his interview about, what the middle meant for him. And it was a bridge. And that really is what he serves as in his podcast, is he's bridging a lot of people that you wouldn't necessarily know are connected. And conversations, he talks about it being an intergenerational podcast. And, so many issues at play today in a world of extremes. And he just, has a gift for bringing people together and bridging the connections there. And so, yes, I'm glad he's bridged our connection as well. Funny story. We were talking a little bit before the break and you were asking, how did we cross at Trevecca? We're both alumni at Trevecca Nazarene University. And we were not students together. You were my professor, Introduction to Communication. They got you fresh out of college and brought you back to be a professor there. You were one of my favorite professors. I was brand new to college life, grew up in a small town, Alabama, Tuscaloosa, Alabama, home, the University of Alabama. But at that time, it was a completely different world. And I was a minnow in an ocean of whales. It was, I'm surprised I made it out without being eaten. It was such an interesting time.
Well, those were some fun times for me and times of such growth because, as I mentioned to you, you got me when I was brand spanking new, fresh professor right out of grad school. And people will laugh and say, that's a tough time to have a new professor because you come out of grad school and you're just armed with all this knowledge and information and you're raring to go. And it was a great place for me to learn, the craft of teaching. And I love those days. But 1987, when you came, that was my very first intro back into Trevecca, and I graduated in 85. So it was probably too soon for me to come back, if the truth be known. And so I was saying to you, there's this, it's weird once you get to the age we are at. I'm pushing 60. You're not quite there yet, but I think about that 1987 time, and it's like, okay, did I know them as co-students or did I know them in that professor-student relationship? Because it really was so close together. But I'm glad you straightened out and told me.
It was a great time. You were a good professor. You were so creative. Like, we would meet outside on the hill, and I know you talked with Michael a little bit about your work with Gallup and the Strengths Finder. I don't think you had that instrument at that time, but you had some other things that you were doing with us, and you were just so good at pulling instruction out of the box, so you had gifts as a professor. Even fresh out of grad school, you had some really good ideas and really good gifts, and I appreciate your class. You're one of the professors. I remember you and Bib Faith. I thought my Bib Faith professor was going to go to hell. I really did. I just small conservative church grew up in, and very fundamentalist. I mean, kind of give you an idea of where I grew up. I remember the pastor preaching against wearing pants one time when a lady walked into our church, a guest, first time guest, she wore pants. And so he decided that he was going to preach on why you would go to hell if you wore pants.
And aren't you glad you came to that, what most people think is still a conservative Christian university? It was difficult for you at that point in time, but aren't you glad that we had opportunity to have our minds stretched in some ways? And we were privileged because we didn't have professors who were out to deconstruct our faith like some places, but they were definitely out to challenge us and grow us and expand our minds. But it's funny you would say that about the pants thing, because, it was just homecoming weekend this past weekend at Trafficking. My husband and I were there, and he just kept saying, look, can you see all these students walking around in shorts?
Yeah, I know.
Not allowed to do that even in the season we were there.
Yeah, we had to wear, the girls had to wear sweatpants over their shorts if they were going to walk across campus, because God forbid if they were to tempt a young man, that just would be, all she wrote. I mean, it's the equivalent of wearing makeup, I'm
so grateful for Dr. Dan Boone's season as our university president. And my own son, my older son, went through Trevecca on his watch. And I tell Dan all the time, I'm very grateful that my son got to go on your watch, because we began to really sift out essentials, from non-essentials and just expand in some good, fresh ways. So.
Dan is unique voice in the Church of the Nazarene in that he can walk in both worlds well.
Mm-hmm.
He can walk in the pastoral world and he can talk to the layperson on their level, not preach at them, but have a conversation with them, but simultaneously challenge the minds of people in academia, and speak on their level to say, look, don't sit so far above the clouds from the congregation, from the pew, that somehow or another you lose the ability to talk with them, because when you do, you lose.
Yeah, I believe he's a masterful communicator. I just saw that again when he spoke at the Founders Day Chapel at Trevecca. And quite frankly, and this will be getting ahead. I know you want me to tell parts of my story, but at the time, even in my own story, when I received an unexpected call to preach and to pastor, I already had enough degrees at that time, so I didn't need to go back for another degree, but I needed to do the preparation, do the course of study for ordination, and I was able to take Dan Boone's preaching class that he was doing in the master's program, and it was one of the best pieces of my ordination education was getting to sit under him in that particular course. So
he the thing I took away from his preaching class that I still use today in almost every context, not just in ministry context, but just when everyday conversations in the public and with people when it turns to faith. And that is that God's judgment is his first act of salvation, not his last act of salvation. And that is such a key thought that we need. I think in the environment that we have, the culture that we have today, where Christianity has been caricatured to the point that it has and kind of conflated with nationalism and so many different flavors out there, and often it looks more like Caesar's empire than it does Jesus' faith,
Right. And I just, because you mentioned even Michael's podcast, Michael in the Middle, that whole idea of the middle way, as Wesleyans, the via media, the middle way, we are people who are trying to remain balanced. And I just heard something yesterday about, social media and the algorithms and how it gets us so out of whack that it's the extreme right and the extreme left voices that get all the playtime, but they're only 7 or 8% of the population on either end. And so the moderate voice has effectively been muted, which is so sad. And then they were talking about a concept called basically structural stupidity, that that we create that when all we're hearing are the voices of the extreme. And you're right, Jeff, there's just so much that the church needs to work on these days. And I love that idea of, the intersectionality of so many things coming together, and that truth is really in the middle of all that. We have to work hard to, to find it and to and voice it.
Yeah. You're talking about the social media, and I am 99% sure you've read this book, Neil Postman's Oh Shucks. The name just left me, the name of that book. Entertaining Ourselves to Death or something like that. Entertaining Ourselves to Death. Very good book, though. I just picked it back up a couple of months ago. But wow, was he a prophetic voice. He wrote it in 82. It is as relevant today and more relevant today. He was more lamenting how media changed, and news media specifically. And this was before 24/7 news. But from the written to the visual. And he was kind of lamenting that and said that made as big of an impact as the press did, because prior to the press, you had oral culture where everything was storytelling. And then for the first time, once the press was written, everybody could kind of read things. It was en masse. You didn't have to go to the local town square to hear things, but now you can read in the privacy of your home once you learn to read, right? And they said now with local news, it becomes about entertainment,
right,
as opposed to communication.
Right.
And that's what we have.
As an old communication person, I mean, that is all those communication theories are so central to who I am and all the things that I've done. And I think all the things that God has called me to, but going back to some of those core principles. And I too lament the change in mass media, because now we don't even get a true reporting of the news. It's that, the news reports they're reporting on what's the divisive communication that's happening on Twitter, and news is going to Twitter, to find your news instead of giving us the real news. So I'm kind of glad, Jeff, way back when, my earliest dream, I was going to be the next Barbara Walters.
I remember you saying that with Michael, yeah.
I mean, as a young person, journalism, I was, on the school newspaper, and journalism was really where I thought it was going. And I lived in North Carolina at the time, and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill had this program, a radio, TV, motion picture institute, that they invited students between their junior and senior year of high school to come and try to check out that program. Well, as a 16-year-old, my very first job was at a small radio station, and it's WHIP in Mooresville, North Carolina. That's where I got my start.
So you were hip.
I was. Well, we actually called it the whip. But they would have done better, I think, if they would call it whip. But so as a teenager, I had a radio show, and I tried out for this scholarship through the Jefferson Pilot Broadcasting. That was the big broadcasting association in Charlotte that sponsored our radio station, and got this scholarship opportunity to go to UNC to this RTVMP Institute. And that is where I was headed. And God totally shifted my path. And as I look back, He does all things well. I'm so thankful I did not enter that arena when I see where that arena has gone. And it's not that, again, I mean, we need Christian voices in every, facet of life and every business and industry. But I'm just thankful that God changed my path in terms of what I was going to do, as a career.
You can be a co-creator with God by helping to echo our guest voices, share our episodes with friends and family and on your own social media accounts. Give us positive 5-star reviews. The more positive reviews we have, the more visibility we have, and the more voices that are echoed through eternity. We often invite guests who are serving faithfully year after year, often in anonymity in their respective roles in ministries. God sees them, and the reality is for a good kingdom leader, that's enough. We do not do what we do for the accolades of humanity. We do it because we're called by God. But I believe that God uses people like you and I to continue those reverberations and echo them throughout eternity. You can partner with God by liking, subscribing, writing a quick positive 5-star review, and again, sharing those voices with friends and family and on your own social media accounts. Those reviews will eventually lead to other guests who have larger platforms that have more listeners who will then in turn listen to the show. And again, it further echoes those voices, which is the whole vision of the Echoes Through Eternity podcast here, is to continue echoing those voices that God is echoing through eternity there. So like and subscribe and review us if you would. We'd appreciate that greatly. Yeah, it's you and I talked a little bit before about the varied experiences you have had. So you talked about your time you wanted to be the Barbara Walters. You just talked about your time. We talked about your time at Trafficking as a professor. Talk a little bit about one of the things that I've heard you say is that God is constantly remaking us, and then how that works with our calling, and even, truth and intersectionality. You've touched on some of this stuff there. Discuss that with us, because I think it's so interesting and relevant.
Yeah, I firmly believe that God's call is dynamic, that it is constantly shifting and moving. I just think about, even the Old Testament stories of just God leading his people, the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night, and that he was moving them on a journey. And then I think about Jesus' favorite word, follow, follow me. And the very first thing he even said to his disciples as he was calling them was he simply wanted to get them curious. It was like, come and see what I'm doing. And I just know that is how he has worked with me. It is if I'm following intimately after him, then he is always out in front of me, and he's moving, and my job is just to keep up. I love the scripture about the spirit, the winds of the spirit blowing, and we don't know where the spirit really comes from, and we don't know where the spirit's going. But the point is, put up your sails and keep the spirit. And I just know that there are a lot of young people that I talk to, and they really struggle with just thinking that God's will is just this concrete one set thing, and that if they don't get it right the first time, they're going to miss it. They're going to miss it will for their lives. And I just want to say to them, God calls us first just to himself. And if you accept that call to a deep intimacy with him, then you're not going to miss it, because you're going to stay in step with the Spirit. And we're always tempted to either run ahead of the Spirit or lag behind the Spirit, but the key is keeping in step with the Spirit. And I think one of the saddest things that I've ever heard, I had a mom come to me one time during my pastoral ministry years, and she was an older mother, and her son was, a middle-aged son. And he had left the ministry. He had left the pastoral ministry. And she was devastated because she had been brought up or raised or felt like, that the call of God cannot be revoked. And this, the way we sometimes will take things, people will, and they'll twist them. And she really felt like, oh, he's walked out on God's call on his life. And she was so lamenting, how could he have done this? Well, I knew her son, and I knew what was happening in his life. And it wasn't that he had turned his back on a call. It was God was reshaping him, reshaping the call, reforming him, remaking him. And I think we've got to understand that's really what biblical holiness is. It's a constant renewal in the image of God. And so if we don't think God's gonna change us, now granted, I know some people can get in a bad habit of changing themselves and jumping ship maybe in a calling when the calling gets tough. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about not being consistent, not having a constancy of purpose. But literally, God has pretty much remade my calling about every 10 or 12 years. And it's been the most exciting journey. That way you don't get stagnant, you stay fresh. And it's not that, again, I'm not saying that the opposite would not also be true. There are people who can find a life calling and stay in that very place for 30 years, but that's why it's unique. The calling is unique to each of us, and our our giftings and passions and just what God needs done. And so I believe he moves us around, and we need to give people the freedom to do that.
Yeah, that's so good. We tend to think I think our theology is important because it shapes our behavior. And I think sometimes we misread Genesis' story of creation and think, well, creation was this one-time act by God. But creation is an ongoing act of God. He creates life every day. He breathes breath into us every day, not just then. He breathes breath into me. He breathed it from second to second, from moment to moment. He breathes life into us, right? And then we're co-creators. It's not just God forcing his image on someone. He shapes and molds, and then we move and ebb and flow with God's call in our life and are willing to be pliable, right? And that is so important, I think. And it's one of the things I've tried to instill in my kids. I briefly spoke about how naive I was when I came to Trafficking. I have, as a result of that, tried to instill in my children, look, don't be so concrete in your faith and so concrete in your understanding of God that there's no room for new understanding there, so that somebody has to completely destroy your faith in order for you to have faith, right? And so Blaine, that's my son, he's 18, is at Trafficking this year. And so, one of the first conversations we had was about biblical faith. And so he called back. So, son, remember, I told you that would be your most challenging class because they're going to give you some new ideas. College is about stretching you and helping you understand so that God's preparing you for that future, for his call on your life.
Right. And instead of being rigid, I think we just stand firm by standing firm in our confidence in God and confidence in his call and confidence in what he's doing. And then we can stand firm and let all kind of things blow around us and by us. And we can stay firm in our commitment to him, but allow him to stretch our thinking, our minds, our hearts, our souls, our spirits. And Jeff, I thought when I came back to Trafficking, now when I came back in 1987, when you were one of my first students, I didn't stay at Trafficking. It wasn't a continuous. I had 2 years of service, and then really realized that I had come back too soon as a professor, and also I was needing to get a doctorate. If I really was going to stay in Christian higher education, I needed to get that doctorate, and because I moved back to Nashville, the doctorate that seemed to fit was at Vanderbilt, and I could not afford my Vanderbilt education on my Trafficking salary at that point in time. And I thought, God can use my Christian voice in business and industry, and I want to dabble in that for a little bit and let it help pay for my Vanderbilt education, and then use that as a training grounds for me. So I did. I went to Northern Telecom and then Executive Learning. Spent those years in some wonderful, wonderful places in business while I was getting that degree. And it was funded, by those businesses. Then when God was ready, he took everything that I learned in the business arena. And at that time, it was now early 90s. The total quality management movement was in full bloom. That's what I had been trained in the business world. And I looked back at my beloved alma mater at Trafficking, and we did not have a master's program at that time in the whole business realm. And I saw a greenfield opportunity. And at that point in time, kind of MBAs were sort of getting a bad rap. They were sort of dime a dozen, and they were getting a bad rap for being too focused on the hard sciences, the econ and the finance and the accounting and the legal. And there was so much on the soft side of the organization where we were failing in our people skills. And of course, that's where communications and human relations had trained me and built me up. And then the total quality movement. And so I thought, I'm going to pitch this idea. And I went back to the administrators at Trafficking and I said, we need a master's degree in this arena. And they liked my ideas and said, well, why don't you come back on board and help us do that? And so there was an opening in the communication studies department, which I had hailed from. And then they were beginning this MHR program, they call it now, this degree completion program,
Sure.
management and human relations. And then I was pitching this graduate program. So I kind of came back and did the big trifecta of leading the communication department while helping to lead this new MHR program and while laying the foundation for the curriculum and the program that would eventually, we called it, when I founded it, was Masters in Organizational Management. Now it's MAOL, Master of Arts in Organizational Leadership, but it's the program that morphed from this one. And we just took a quality focus, a TQM focus. We took a servant leadership focus and how badly businesses needed Christian ethics and needed strong leadership and built that program. And so that's when I came back to Trafficking in the fall of 91 and then was there for 10 years, really leading those programs. And those were great days.
Yeah. Don't you wish God would let us wear one hat at a time sometimes?
I don't think I would be the person I am today if he hadn't trained me up, having to know how to juggle, be lean and mean and take care of those things. Although I know I don't want to sound like I don't understand self-care because it can be too much. And when it's too much, you have to make a change. And
Yeah. There's been many conversations I've had with God. Like, God, if I so admire my wife, she has been teaching for 31 years. She's fantastic. She's got a PhD in curriculum. They're constantly trying to get her to come into leadership. She says, nope, I want the classroom. The closest she's come to leadership is to be a mentor teacher. And so that she trains other teachers. When she's coming up on retirement in one more year, she'll be eligible to retire in Georgia. And she'll have 30 years in Georgia. And so she's looking at what she wants to do there. And she says, I would love to go back to Trafficking and teach teach the teachers there because she really likes teaching the teachers. But she said, I love the classroom, not as much these days because it has turned so political and everything.
It's a tough time to be a teacher. It's a tough time to be an educator. Again, my oldest son is
but she's done teaching her whole life. And I tell her, I wish I could just do one thing and get great at it,
That's me. I think that kind of was my segue out of my teaching years at Trafficking because same thing. I loved the teaching, learning. I was an administrator by necessity in terms of, founding this program and wanting to lead at that level. But that wasn't really what I aspired to, not the administrative role. It was really the teaching, learning that happened in the classroom. And the longer I was there, the more they were trying to move me into administration. I think I can say this because I think this is what was happening, but I think I was being groomed to be the first female on the leadership team, the senior, the president's cabinet.
Yeah.
There had never been a female to that point in time. And I've always kind of been I'm woman, hear me roar kind of gal. I was the first female student body president.
Okay.
That was in the 80s. It's like, what took us so long?
Yeah.
But I think they were grooming me for that position, but I think that was part of the stirring in my heart because it was then that God began to do this new thing that I told you he does about every 10 to 12 years. And I was being stirred about a call to preach and to pastor. And I think that part of that was that I wasn't supposed to leave the teaching arena and just move into administration, that the Lord wanted to now claim my teaching gifts and my administration gifts for the local church and for true vocational ministry. I mean, I felt like I was doing kingdom work at Trafficking. You don't teach at a Christian university and not feel like you're doing kingdom work. But God made it more specific and said, no, I'm now moving you into vocational ministry. You're going to get ordained, you're going to preach, and you're also going to help a growing church create the infrastructure it needs to do what I'm asking it to do. And that took some of my business and management and leadership and communication skills to do that. So, I mean, God's so wise. You look back and you see his wisdom, and he was claiming all those gifts and moving me into this new territory. And I loved every minute of my 14 years of associate pastoral ministry in Hermitage Church of the Nazarene. And wow, at that point, I thought Christian higher education had been tough. Whew, those ministry years, really tough. Then, if that wasn't hard enough, God said, well, now I'm going to move your ministry outside the walls of your home church, which I didn't realize how safe ministry had been in the walls of my church, even though it was hard. Because I had heard everything in the pastoral counseling office. I felt like I had seen it all and heard it all, and ministry was tough. But it's like God always ups the ante, and he was now moving me into you're gonna take your ministry outside the walls of the church and leave the confines of that safety, and I'm really gonna make you uncomfortable and push you outside your comfort zone. And that's really when Rest Stop Ministries was born, what I'm doing right now. And I never would have aspired to this, but it's what we were talking about earlier. I was just living in step with Jesus, and he called. And when he calls, a long, long time ago, I laid down the ultimate yes, to anything you'll ask me to do, God. It doesn't mean that at the time that he's moving me out of one thing that I love into something else, it doesn't mean I'm not wrestling with him a little bit. And you go kind of kicking and screaming in the beginning, and then you begin to see his wisdom, and you just move into the joy of the next thing he's calling you to.
So that's a great time to talk about your Rest Stop Ministries there, and talk about that, how you discern that call. I think that's one of the toughest things that I hear when I'm talking with people, is in those initial stages of the call, trying to discern when God is calling them to move into a new direction. It's a scary time because it's beyond our comfort zone. It's not what we're used to. It's not what we envisioned. It's often unexpected. I know you mentioned you went to a retreat or a monastery up in Kentucky. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and it's a good thing that you are pointing out, because again, as I'm counseling, mentoring, particularly younger people, but anybody, about discerning God's call, one of the things I've learned is that with God, there are no real emergencies. Like, God does his best work slowly. And he has always been so graceful in allowing me that time to make the shift, to make the turn. He starts planting seeds, and I'm sensing things. It's like he's stirring the waters, before the miracle. He's stirring the waters. He's stirring up a little divine discontent, if you will, with where I've been. He's showing me things. So it's a process, and it's a process over time, because I will just say it took 4 years for me to make a clean break from my pastoral ministry, because it was in June of 2011, after I'd had 10 years of pastoral ministry, and I was given a sabbatical, a summer sabbatical. And I was trying to discern what's the next 10 years of my ministry supposed to look like. And if we're asking God honestly, what is it you want me to do? And not, am I just moving in my own agenda? Am I moving in my own strength? If we're serious about asking him, he's going to shine the light and show us. And so June of 2011, I took a silent retreat at the Abbey of Gethsemane Monastery in Kentucky for the sheer purpose of getting alone with God and listening to him. And he had been breaking my heart. And here's the other way that I know that we can sense a call is we pray, God, break my heart for what breaks yours, but then we got to be ready to move into that arena. And so praying that sincere prayer, praying, I was taking my church at that time through the book called Radical, how the American dream had almost hijacked our faith. And I was saying very honestly to the Lord, I don't want that to be me. I don't want to be too comfortable in the American dream. I don't want it to hijack my faith. And so I just believe if we're honest and authentic and get to that quiet place, then he'll begin to be more clear. And so these stirrings started to become a very clear direction, because while I was on that silent retreat, I'm basically in a replica of the Garden of Gethsemane. I'm staring at a statue of the agonizing Jesus, who I know what he's doing is wrestling it to the mat. Your will or my will. And it's like, okay, that's what I'm doing. I'm here and I'm wrestling this thing to the mat. And I basically sat down in a chair and got quiet. And the Lord took me to every scripture that I think I had literally been avoiding my whole life, which was the core of his heartbeat for the last and the least and the lost. And that's why I'm saying, Jeff, again, I loved my ministry on a college campus. I loved my ministry in the confines of the church. But for me, both of those were privilege. They were privilege. They were the ability to minister almost, if you will, in just a place of privilege. And I guess I had always thought missionaries who went to some of the worst places on the planet, were heroes of mine, but I never really thought God was going to call me that direction. And then I'm hearing him say, I want you to give up your place of privilege. And I'm not taking you across the world to Africa or to China, but I am taking you to a place of darkness that you've never had to live. And so what Rest Stop Ministries is, we are a long-term residential restoration program for female survivors of sex trafficking. And God began to break my heart for the issue of human trafficking around the globe, particularly the stories of sex trafficking, because as a woman, I could not imagine a worse fate, especially when I look back to my childhood, my girlhood, and my teenage years. I couldn't imagine a worse fate of having been taken, held captive, and forced to perform sexual acts over and over and over again with perfect strangers, most of whom would abuse me, and there would be violence, and there would be all manner of evil. I couldn't imagine that. And to think that children and teenagers and women, this was their reality. And there seemed to be no way out. And I heard Jesus ask me a very clear question in that garden that day. He said, if she is not free, then why are you free? Do you think I love you more than I love her? And literally, I was almost strangled with grief, overcome by, I haven't really understood love my neighbor as I love myself. It means love my neighbor in the same way that I love myself. As much as I love me, and as much attention and care as I give my own freedom and the freedoms that I want to have. And it was, are you working that hard for someone else's freedom? And I was broken in that garden that day, and literally came home, and Rest Stop Ministries was born.
Wow. You can be a co-creator with God by helping to echo our guest voices, share our episodes with friends and family and on your own social media accounts. Give us positive 5-star reviews. The more positive reviews we have, the more visibility we have, and the more voices that are echoed through eternity. We often invite guests who are serving faithfully year after year, often in anonymity in their respective roles in ministries. God sees them, and the reality is for a good kingdom leader, that's enough. We do not do what we do for the accolades of humanity. We do it because we're called by God. But I believe that God uses people like you and I to continue those reverberations and echo them throughout eternity. You can partner with God by liking, subscribing, writing a quick positive 5-star review, and again, sharing those voices with friends and family and on your own social media accounts. Those reviews will eventually lead to other guests who have larger platforms that have more listeners, who will then in turn listen to the show. And again, it further echoes those voices, which is the whole vision of the Echoes Through Eternity podcast here, is to continue echoing those voices that God is echoing through eternity there. So like and subscribe and review us if you would. We'd appreciate that greatly. And then the miracle of that, the way God provided for you guys, he gave you guys land in the middle of, that land's worth millions today, I can imagine.
It's unbelievable. And I will say this, what God calls you to, he will equip you for, and he will provide. He is faithful. And I have to remind him of that every day. God, you called us out of nothing. You are our Jehovah Jireh. You are our provider. But yes, it took 4 years from the time of that call in the garden of June 2011 to build the infrastructure for the 501c3 to develop a program that we knew would be the kind of program he wanted us to have, and then to locate the perfect property place to do this. And yes, God is such a redeemer that he used a horrific tragedy, and it happened in February of 2014. It happened to fellow Nazarenes, a family from First Church of the Nazarene in Nashville. A horrific tragedy happened on their property, a beautiful property, 25 acres and 2 beautiful homes that the matriarch had named Good Hope Farms because she told her 4 adult children all their lives from the time they were little, but she just always told them, kids, we don't just have hope, we have a good hope. And his name is Jesus Christ. And so this whole property was named Good Hope Farms because of her trust in the good hope of Jesus. And then she lost her life in a crime that occurred on that property. And her husband lost his life, and it left her 4 children and their families absolutely devastated. And one of her children and her family lived on this farm. That was the 2 houses, the matriarch and patriarch, and then one of her children and their family lived there. And basically, it was such a horrific tragedy that they left that day with the clothes on their back and didn't ever want to come back to that property. And at the time, the crime, it captured the attention of places like 2020 and Dateline, and they were coming and asking this family, for this story. And they basically said to them, no, we are not giving you this story because all you want to do is exploit the evil. And this is another reason why, Jeff, I was so glad at the time I'm not in this industry anymore, because that's where it was. So much of the journalism is just, they want to just exploit. It's exploitive. And that's what Rest Stop stands firm against is people should be able to live their life and not be exploited. And they said, we're not going to give you this story, but someday when God redeems this tragedy and redeems this land and brings good and creates beauty from the ashes of what's happened here, someday we might tell the story. Well, we're the rest of that story, Jeff, because Rest Stop Ministries, through only God's direction and providence, again, it's nothing I would have ever gone after myself, but God's holy network. I love God's holy network. He connected us through other mutual acquaintances and spiritual friends and family in the church, and literally said, you're supposed to go and offer to purchase this property, because the property, they were afraid no one would ever want to come by it because of what had happened on it. And yet the family was left kind of destitute and needed the money from that asset to be able to move forward. And so we were not gifted that property, but God said, you're supposed to buy that property. And we had saved enough from another direction we were going to go. I need to tell this part of the story because it's important. I was going for a property, a mansion, Tremont Mansion, that sits next door to Hermitage Church of the Nazarene. I was still on the pastoral staff at Hermitage Nazarene. And I would look out my window every day and see this mansion that sat next to our church. And I knew that there was an 80-year-old woman who lived there by herself who wanted to get rid of that property, wanted to sell that property. And I said, God, who better than women and girls whose lives have been hell on earth to live in a mansion? In my Father's house are many mansions. I'm claiming that mansion for you, God. And for Rest Stop Ministries. And that's the vision we initially cast when we were first, raising money. But God sometimes picks up the road and moves it. And the detour becomes the way. And I want people to hear that too, because that's part of the dynamic call of God is we may be going one direction, but we're going that direction. It's not that we didn't hear him. I heard him clearly. He told me to go for that mansion. Had I not been raising the money for Tremont Mansion, I wouldn't have had the down payment raised when he opened up the way and said, no, the way is Good Hope Farms. And so we were able to come alongside this family and say, God wants us to offer to buy your offer to buy your farm. And do you know that family, when I met with them, I met with 3 of the sisters. The brother couldn't make it that day, but of the 4 siblings, I met with 3 of the sisters. And literally, it was holy ground, Jeff. We took our shoes off. That's how holy the holy ground was, because they were all believers, and they said, your offer is the first sign of hope, where we can actually lift our chins from this tragedy and look up and say, okay, God is going to do this. With all things, with God, all things is possible. And we were their first sign of hope. And literally, I felt the Lord saying to me, you thought this was only about the particular survivors I told you were going to serve in Rest Stop Ministries, these survivors of human trafficking. But before you even open your doors, you're going to help this group of survivors. And you're going to provide hope for them. And so we purchased that property, and you're right, it is worth so much more now than it was then. We thought it was such a stretch. In fact, we don't own it yet. The bank still owes it, but we're ticking away at it very steadily, little by little. But God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, and God said, "I will help you do this," and then He's going to help us with the next thing too.
Yeah.
We just know it.
Such an amazing story there. Now, talk a little bit. What is your process for rescuing these? Well, first, what does Rest Stop? I know that's an acronym. What does Rest Stop stand for?
It stands for Restore. The rest is restore survivors, and the stop is stop this horrific criminal oppression of sex trafficking. And so it's that 2-pronged thing. And then also it has double meaning. God also said you're going to provide them a rest stop, a resting place on this arduous journey they've been on. And it's still going to be a tough journey once they leave you to fully rehabilitate and reenter society, but you're going to provide that resting place where they're going to learn how to rest in me. They're going to stop the madness of their life, and they're going to come to this safe sanctuary oasis, and they're going to get the healing that they need to then be able to move forward. And so that's what we do. We've been operating now for 7 years, really Tennessee's first long-term residential restoration program designed solely and specifically and uniquely for this population, adult female survivors of sex trafficking. And we say to them, Jeff, you just come and do the hard work of healing. And it's terribly hard work to heal from that level of complex trauma. And it takes all the experts out there would tell you it takes a minimum of 2 years. And so we say for 2 full years, you just come and live with us free of charge to you, and we will take care of your every need while you're focusing on healing. And so we house them, clothe them, feed them, provide all their personal necessities, all their transportation needs, their medical, dental, vision, their job skills training, education, their legal aid, their family reconciliation, just everything that they need to not only heal from the trauma, but then to begin to rehabilitate. If we don't help these women become economically independent, then just the cycles of victimization repeat. And so the point is, by the time they leave us, they, number one, have completed our 18-month healing program. They've maintained their sobriety the entire time, because most of them are trying to beat addiction as well that goes along with the trafficking. And mental illness goes along with it as well, a minimum of PTSD, and then all manner of depression and anxiety, and because of what they've been through. And so they complete our healing program, they maintain their sobriety, and then we help them find a job earning a living wage. And then we make sure that they have reliable transportation to and from that job. And we're not on public transit where we are out east of town. We're in Wilson County. And so that means we're helping them find a car, a vehicle. And then we have to help find them safe, affordable, permanent housing to move into, which, the housing market, and it getting harder and harder to do. It's why we're focusing now on how do we come around them in that 3rd year. I mean, we already offered them 2 years free of charge, but they really need another year for us to come around them and help them make that transition and support them. So we're working now on alumni aftercare. And then we've launched a social enterprise so that they can actually start earning sooner in our program. We create a trauma-informed work environment for them to work in, and they can work sooner. We've had a lot of good employer partners, but for the women a lot of times when they would go out and start working, they would start getting re-triggered and all of that, and relapse could occur. And it's just so much better if we can have a social enterprise to help them work in a safer environment in the beginning and then move them more to other kinds of employment. So that's really what we're doing. We're completely donor supported.
How amazing. And then as you're talking, I'm thinking you're literally rebuilding the lives of women, and how ironic in a world so focused on deconstructing. Everything is about deconstructing every part of society, from religion to institutions to government to everything being deconstructed. And you guys, in my complaint, always people, look, if you want to reshape, reform, that's fine. But don't tear something down if you don't have an idea what you're going to build back there, right? But you guys absolutely know what you're building there.
And in fact, there is destruction because what we're tearing down is the lies of Satan. We're having to tear down the lies that they've been told about their worth and who they are. That's the dismantling we have to do. And I believe revival is two parts. I believe it's some dismantling, but it's mostly the remantling on the truth of Jesus. And you are a beloved child of God, created in his image for greatness, for works that he planned for you to do before the foundations of the earth. And it's giving these women an opportunity to reimagine what was life supposed to be for me. And, to your point, we feel like we're rebuilding lives, remaking lives. Some of these women will come to us and say, no, you're not remaking me. I'm starting from scratch. I never had a life. You're just teaching me how to build on a firm foundation and just have a life to begin with.
What are some of what is the average age of the lady who ends up getting pulled into the sex trafficking? Is it really young? Is it a teenager?
The average age of entry is 13. And that's the average age. So, girls a lot younger. And even though I said we serve adult women, they have to be 18 to come into our program. But we're serving all those little girls grown up. I mean, 98% of the women we serve will tell you their exploitation began in childhood. But it just so happens that, it's a very particular kind of thing to work with minors, yes, and all that. And that's not what God called us to do. But starting at age 18, and then all that healing that they never got an opportunity to do. They never healed from their childhood trauma. They never had a chance. And so we're meeting women of all ages. I mean, the youngest we've served is 18. The oldest we've served is 60. Right now, we're serving a 60-year-old woman who's never had the opportunity to heal from her trauma. In fact, she came right out of a trafficking situation. And that's a high number. Oftentimes they are kicked to the curb sooner than that, because once they become no longer desirable or whatever, they're kicked to the curb. But anyway, we meet them wherever they are. And for even the 60-year-old, so many times she's back. She's that young person, because your trauma kind of stunts your growth at times to the age you were when your trauma began. And we're going all the way back and helping them heal from the inside out on the truth.
Yeah. Are they United States-based women, primarily international?
Okay, that's a great question, because we serve domestic trafficking. It is a domestic issue. Everyone we serve is a citizen of the United States of America.
Wow.
It's one of the myths. When we first opened, I think more people talked to me and they thought we were probably serving foreign nationals. They expected we had a house full of Asians or Hispanics. And for me to tell them, the first two cohorts, if you will, that came through, these were Caucasian Tennesseans.
Wow.
And it blindsided people. They didn't understand. I said, these are our own children, because familial trafficking, people being trafficked by their own families, it's one of there are two that we see more frequently. And that's one of the ones that we see more frequently. The opioid addiction crisis in Tennessee, cyclical poverty, people are selling their own children into sexual slavery because they can't pay the rent or because they need that next hit of their drug that they're addicted to. And it's one of the most tragic, sad things that you would ever know. So these are our kids. And again, we expand at some point and serve foreign nationals because they need to be served as well. And this is happening all over the globe, and they need to be served as well. But I want people to know, in the United States of America, this is happening hidden in plain sight in every zip code in America. And we have to open our blind eyes and see it. And one more statistic I'll tell you that'll break your heart, Jeff. And I know our time's winding down, but pornography is a driver of sex trafficking. And this shocks people when I tell them the United States of America is the number one both consumer and producer of child pornography. I mean, we have so much work to do in this country on this issue.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that definitely breaks your heart, and that is an issue in and of itself. The whole pornographic addiction that it targets our kids. I mean, my son was 8 years old when he was first exposed to that, on YouTube.
That's the age. That's what people don't understand. For males in particular, the age of first exposure is 8 years old. And if as a church, we don't wake up and get our heads out of the sand and say, this can no longer be a shame-based issue, because kids, it becomes something that happens by accidental exposure, generally in the beginning, and then it hijacks the brain. Mm-hmm. And so we have to treat it as another medical issue or condition, if you will, a disease-based model, so that our kids can get the help that they need. Because if we keep it a shame-based issue, they're going to stay in the closet. They're not going to come forward for help. Yeah. And so, I'm on the evangelistic mission right now about that.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Smith, Rondi, I appreciate your time with us today, as you have been a blessing, and certainly will be an enlightening subject for so many people out there. Just as you were talking, both of my children are adopted. We got my daughter when she was 2 days old.
Oh, wow.
She's in our foster care. My son was 3.5. He was a Hurricane Katrina refugee. His mom was on all kinds of drugs. She fled Hurricane Katrina. He was 9 months old, sold him for drugs at a place. And then the police came and from there, and he got into foster care. So we rescued those two out. While we were fostering those two in process of adoption, there was a Auburn University professor who had fostering a child and was sex trafficking her. And that was in our neighborhood.
I know. And so, Jeff, the heartbreak firsthand. I didn't realize that. Thank you for telling me that, because, again, exploitation is happening in every arena. We don't like to think about it. We don't like to imagine it. And it particularly breaks our heart that those most vulnerable, like you said, kids already in foster care who are so vulnerable, and then someone taking advantage of them like that, nothing can make my blood boil than people taking advantage and exploiting children. So you know this full well. Thank you for adopting those children. And thank you for the opportunity to come on today. I pray for your listeners that
thank you.
Anything that we've said today would be for the edification of the folks out there.
Yes. And for those listening, we will be placing a link to the Rest Stop Ministries in the show notes, as well as Dr. Smith's contact information, and a way for you to support their ministry. As you hear, they are rebuilding the lives of people 1 minute at a time, and that's expensive work. You think healthcare alone is an overwhelming cost, and then food on top of inflation, and housing, and then trying to find a safe place for them to work. I mean, one of those issues would be overwhelming for a local church to try and support, especially when you consider the local church average size is about 70. It's impossible. So you guys are absolutely, thank you for listening to God's call and for providing that ministry to your people there in Tennessee.
We all can't do everything, but we all can do something.
Thank you. Amen. Thank you very much. You have a great day, Ms. Smith. Dr. Smith, have a great day.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
You can be a co-creator with God by helping to echo our guest voices. Share our episodes with friends and family and on your own social media accounts. Give us positive 5-star reviews The more positive reviews we have, the more visibility we have, and the more voices that are echoed through eternity. We often invite guests who are serving faithfully year after year, often in anonymity in their respective roles in ministries. God sees them, and the reality is for a good kingdom leader, that's enough. We do not do what we do for the accolades of humanity. We do it because we're called by God. But I believe that God uses people like you and I to continue those reverberations and echo them throughout eternity. You can partner with God by liking, subscribing, or writing a quick positive 5-star review, and again, sharing those voices with friends and family and on your own social media accounts. Those reviews will eventually lead to other guests who have larger platforms that have more listeners who will then in turn listen to the show. And again, it further echoes those voices, which is the whole vision of the Echoes Through Eternity podcast here, is to continue echoing those voices that God is echoing through eternity there. So like and subscribe and review us if you would. We'd appreciate that greatly.